that. I want to open the Finance and Audit Committee for Metro Fire on Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. Public opportunities to discuss matters of public interest within the committee scope, including items on or not on the agenda, are available. Are there any speakers?
There are no speakers in person this evening. Art, do we have any attendees?
No attendees.
No virtual attendees.
Thank you. So moving then to the consent items. Do I have a motion? We have one item.
Mr. Chair, I'll move the consent.
And I shall second.
I have a motion and a second. Would the board clerk please take roll?
Dr. Jones,
Aye.
Wood,
Aye.
and Rosali.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Presentation items. Financial report through April 30th, 2022, and CFO O'Toole. Like this.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Directors of Fire Chief Farms. Tonight's bi-monthly fiscal presentation highlights the fiscal trends that we're monitoring for the overall financial health of the district. This presentation is drawn from the Finance Committee report, which you have received, and follows all the way through April 30th, so 10 months into the fiscal year. First slide is the cash balance trends as of April 30th. This slide is our cash balance trends relative to last year. The trend line follows a historical pattern where we spend into the dry period and borrow from the county. Borrowing from the county is necessary until property taxes and property tax revenues transfer and boost our cash balances back up. The green line is the prior year, and the red line is the red line is the prior year, the green line is the current year. And you can see that we're catching up to where we were, where we would normally be in cash balances at the end of April are higher than at the same time last year by about 6.9 million for a total of 76.7 million. Thank you. So before we look at the revenues and expenditures, as we normally do in this meeting, which compare the actuals to the changes approved in the mid-year, I want to step back and provide a visual presentation of for the value of those mid-year adjustments we made a couple months ago. So this is kind of the slide we don't normally do, but I wanted just to present this now. So this chart shows a forecast of what would happen if the board did not act on the mid-year budget. So not recognizing some of the action we took, such as updating medical cost revenues for an additional 2.6 million, recognizing that 3 million in GEMT funding would not be received in 21-22, recognizing services and supplies cuts that save us about 1 million, recognizing additional property tax revenues of 200,000, and recognizing the full annual cost of constant staffing. The table shows that revenues expenditures following a generally historic pattern, but if you look all the way to the right, where all the way to the right, you can see in June that expenditures, the orange line, is markedly above the green line. So the which is the revenues, revealing the $12 million gap, which was closed in the mid-year. So had the board not closed that gap through a mix of revenue recognition, expenditure, reductions and transfers from available balances, that gap would have been closed entirely by reducing general fund reserves. That would have been our choice at the end of the year. We would have ended the reserve end of the year with a reserve ratio of approximately 8% versus the 12.5% we anticipate now, which might be slightly higher, as I'll discuss a little later. So that's good news. The actions were taken, and with that, if we can move on and look at where we are now relative to the mid-year adjustments. Sorry, camera problems. Okay, so this slide shows us still tracking with expected general fund revenues, including taxes, service charges, and medical cost revenues. There are 3 lines. So we're on total revenues. Go back. There's three lines. The green line is the prior year revenues, the red line is current year, and the blue line is budgeted revenues as adjusted in the midyear, as I said. And because it was adjusted in March, the two are tracking closely. The blue and the red are still very close together. We've now received 173.7 million or 98.9% of our projected tax revenues this year. That's 9.8 million or 6% more than we received last year at this time. And at the end of April, I should say. And medical cost revenues were also about 10% higher, 3.5% of last year. And with that, why don't we take a look at medical revenues? So that's the next slide. General fund, not medical cost revenue. There we go. Thank you. These are our medical cost revenues, and the red line is the current year again. Blue line is our budgeted, and green is prior year. Total anticipated annual medical cost revenues, as adjusted by the mid-year budget, is 45.6 million. All the way at the end of the blue line there. At the end of April, we had received 37.9 million and ahead of budgeted revenues for that month by about 1.5 million, which you can see at the end of the red line just above the blue line. On an annualized basis, after 83.3% of the fiscal year is completed at the end of April, 83.25% of estimated revenues have been received. So a little ahead on a calendar basis of revenue receipts. Overall, medical revenues are 3.6 million over last year's revenues after 10 months, due in part, of course, to COVID quarantine that might have suppressed ambulance transport revenues last year. With that, let's look at moving expenditure from revenues to the expenditures. The next slide. After 10 months, general fund expenditures relative to our updated mid-year budget were close to the same. So actual expenditures were 213.4 million and equated to 82.6% of the total annual expenditure budget after 83% of the fiscal year had passed. So relative to last year, expenditures at the end of April were 6.8% or $13.6 million higher. That's mainly because we received a rise in cost increase in services, supplies costs, as well as labor costs and constant staffing. With that, we'll go to labor costs, which is the next slide. So this includes wages, retirements, and benefits, of course. And labor costs make up 82% of our total general fund expenditures. On this slide, the blue line is budget, the red is actual, and the green is prior. And you can see that after 10 months, labor costs are tracking with the mid-year budget number. Red and blue very close together there. And by the end of April, employee wages remained high relative to prior year, mainly because of constant staffing callbacks. Of course, constant staffing callbacks are the overtime costs generated when a suppression member must come in to cover for another staff member who's out sick or for unplanned absence for some reason. After 83% of the fiscal year, constant staffing has consumed about 76.1% of the revised mid-year budget allotment, or 20.5 million of the 26.9 million total. So a little bit under there, which is a good thing. Some of this constant staffing increase in overall costs is due to deployments, of course, but also staffing shortages caused by things like sick days and COVID. And all wage costs are taking all with labor costs together, including constant staffing, are 81.6% of the budget after 10 months. Keep in mind that 83% is the calendar marker there. So after 10 months, it's 83%. So labor costs as of April 30, we're tracking slightly below what we forecast. Now let's look at general fund reserves. Again, sort of following a historical pattern there with the green line is prior year and red is your current year. Let's see, reserves at the end of April were slightly higher than last year. At that point, $250,000 above the current year red line. Very close together there. Moving on to CERBT fund. This slide shows our contributions and earnings in the California Employees Retirement Benefit Trust, or CERBT, which we use to offset future OPEB liabilities. This is not a cash fund, and monies in this trust may only be used to pay for OPEB costs such as retiree health premiums. The total shown at the top, 69.5 million, is made up of contributions over our life of participation in the fund and investment earnings. That number is actually $3 million less than what I presented 2 months ago. So we're starting to see the toll of the markets, things happening in the market are affecting our returns, if you will. And you can see that in the green at the right, how that the trend is now downward on the earnings side, while contributions has continued to build up. Certainly, CalPERS is adjusting their investments for these trends, but you can kind of read the tea leaves that we would expect, to look at this number again in 2 months, and it may not be. So overall, we were about 30% funded 2 months ago. Now we're about 29% funded. So we lost about 1% in that period. Next slide. So other takeaways for this report: mid-year budget solutions are holding up. The $12 million gap is closed. We expect it to remain closed. Labor costs are tracking with the mid-year budget. Constant staffing expenditures appear to be slowing. As I said earlier, 76% of the constant staffing budget is spent after 83% of the fiscal year. Spending is just below the mid-year budget forecast level at 82.6% of the budget at the end of April. And looking ahead to the end of the fiscal year, we see that trend continuing and expect there to be some savings in labor and service and supply spending. Those funds will be used to further build up the general fund reserve or built into next year's budget, of course. This is a presentation item only. My recommendation is to receive and file. Any questions?
Seeing no questions. Thank you for the report. Excellent work as always. So with that, any other questions from the board? Comments?
No, sir.
All right, with that, we complete the agenda for this meeting. Next meeting is July 28th, 2020. And we are adjourned.